Several years ago, a man walked into my office where I was preparing a message. I had a whole host of Bibles, I think 6, spread across my large desk. He said, "Man, how many Bibles does it take for you to be able to write a sermon?" I told him several. I found that one of the best ways to study the Bible is to read passages or a passage from several different translations. Most of us speak the way the modern speech translations speak. That's our vernacular. Most of us do not speak the way of the vernacular of 1611. I know that there are a lot of people who really favor the King James Version. I like it. It's a very good version, and particularly on an old passage like Psalm 23, I find myself going back to it. But the people who say only the King James will do miss something. It wasn't the first English translation. There were several, like the Great Bible or Tyndale. Furthermore, it's been updated or revised over 100 times. It had to be, or else we couldn't understand it. I find people occasionally who say, "Well, I want a literal word-for-word translation of the Old Testament Hebrew and the New Testament Greek." That's impossible. If you know any part of any language, you know that translating from that language to English or from English to that language is impossible to have a word-for-word translation. In some instances, there is one word in another language, and it takes a whole phrase to translate the concept. In addition to that, there are idioms. I grew up on a farm in Arkansas, and occasionally when someone was really doing well, you might hear another person say, "Well, he's in the tall cotton now." I suppose that phrase would not mean very much to someone who hadn't grown up around cotton, and particularly where there are hills. Some of the hills didn't seem to have the nutrients in the soil, maybe not as much moisture as down in the flats. And therefore the stalks of cotton up on those hills were short. They didn't have the capacity to produce very much fruit. Down in the flats, where the cotton was taller, there was the potential for much more fruit. To say that someone's in the tall cotton is simply to say that he's doing well. It's an idiom. Did you know that there are idioms in every language, including Greek? 1 Timothy chapter 3 says that an elder is to be the husband of one wife. That's an idiom. It does not mean, as some translations make it, that he could only have been married once. No, it means that he was faithful to his wife, or as one translation puts it, he is a one-woman man. The translators get that very same phrase in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where the widow who is to be enrolled is to be the wife of one husband. Could she have been married 2 or 3 times and married 2 or 3 husbands? Of course. Most translations understand that and say she must have been faithful to her husband. It's an idiom. Now, as you deal with idioms and trying to understand a particular word, maybe using a phrase, you're probably going to get into some loose translations. And loose translations can become something of a commentary. But even that's okay, I think, because we read commentaries, don't we? A few years ago, Chad and I were speaking to a group that had little cards out on the table in front of us. This is the card that was in front of my desk. It's a quote. "Then by constantly using your faith, the life of Christ will be released deep inside you, and the resting place of his love will become the very source and root of your life." I thought, wow, that's rich. Where did that come from? And the scripture reference is Ephesians 3, verse 17. I was familiar with Ephesians 3:17, and I thought that's not what it says, but it is. Listen to it out of the New American Standard Version. "And that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, as you being rooted and grounded in love." As you are being rooted and grounded in love. But today's Passion Translation says, "Then by constantly using your faith, The life of Christ will be released deep inside you, and the resting place of his love will become the very source and root of your life. You can find the Passion Translation online today. It opens it up for me. It's an illustration of how that studying from different translations can open a passage and make it seem so much more real. My thought for you today, in all of that I've said, is find a way to get the message of God off the page and into your heart. I believe that one of the best ways to do that is by studying with different translations.